Hey guys, alright, so I'm just going to go over the Maya fluids exercise from class. So what we're going to do is make a fire, and we're going to do that by emitting fire from a curved curve, and that's just so we can add a bit more interest to the shape of the fire. So the first thing we're going to do is just go to this curved surfaces tab. We're going to grab this one here, and we're just going to draw out dot by dot a bit of a sort of abstract curve shape, something like that. Press enter. Now we've got our curve, and I'm just going to go into right click, go into control vertex mode, and just pull some of these guys up and down, just add a little bit more variation in the shape. So it's a bit more 3D and not just a flat curve. So blah blah blah. Maybe something like that. I'll just pull this one down a little bit, keep it relatively flat. Okay, so this is going to be what I'm going to emit my fluids from. So the fire is actually going to be created from this curve. So go back into object mode, and I'll just position it where I want it. Next thing I'm going to do is create my fluid. So I'm going to go to fluids, and I'm going to create a 3D container. So this is the default container. The default container actually has an emitter already in it. So I'm just going to expand out and just get rid of that emitter because I don't want to use that. So I'm just going to delete that. So now I've just got my fluid box. Now, as I told you in class, the way this works is the voxels will fill up each cube inside this box. So this is just going to be our base box. If we had a contained sort of fire, we might set our size of this before we started, but I'm actually going to use auto resize for this. So I'm just going to go to this auto resize tab and turn that on. So now it doesn't really matter how big my my container is anyway. So now I'm just going to go back to my curve, and I'm just going to make sure it fits inside this container anyway. So I'm just going to scale it down. So that's going to be my emit object. Now I have to tell Maya that I want to emit from this object. So to do that, I select my curve and my fluid shape, and I go back to fluids. I go to add edit contents, and I choose emit from object. And I'll go to the options. The reason I went into options is because I have to make sure emitter type is set to curve. If you have it set to omni or surface, you'll get an error and it won't work. So I've got it set to curve, just leave that all at default, and I'll choose apply and close. So let's see what happens when I press play now. You can see it just starts creating this big mass of white fluid. Now this doesn't look anything like fire, does it? So we're going to go in and sort of try and make it behave a bit more like fire. First thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at our fluid emitter. We're going to look at the basic emitter attributes. Check our rate. At the moment we'll leave it at 100%. You can scale that up or down if you want it to be denser or more thin. So that's all fine. Next thing we're going to look at is just this fluid emission turbulence here. I'm just going to turn on a little bit of turbulence, and what that does is it just adds a bit of variation into the emission. Can't turn it up too high or things will start going crazy. Might just add a little bit of detail in there as well. So I'll set them both to 1, the turbulence and the detail turbulence. So we still can't really tell what's going on. Let's make the resolution of our fluid a bit higher. So we'll go to the fluid shape, and for our working file we'll set it to maybe 40. So now when I play, you'll see it's going to be slower to solve, but it's going to give us a better result and a better idea of what it's actually going to look like. And another way to get a better look at how this actually looks is to turn on some self-shadowing, and that way we'll get a bit more of an outline of what it actually looks like. So we'll scroll all the way down and we'll go to lighting and we'll just click self-shadow. We'll get this sort of dark shadow, and that just gives us a bit more detail in the shapes that we're getting now. So next thing we're going to do is look at the properties of this movement. So fluid has a few different ways of aspects to its calculations, and these are under contents method. So here we've got density, and that's set to dynamic grid. Now the density is basically how thick and visible the fluid is. And we've also got velocity, also set to dynamic grid, and that controls the movement. And we have controls for both of these. We're not going to look at temperature or fuel yet, because first we're going to get the movement we like, and then we're going to add in some temperature to make it look like fire. But we're going to wait on that. So the next thing to do is look at our contents method, our contents details. We're going to look at our density first. First thing we're going to do is add a little bit of buoyancy, and buoyancy is basically how fast the fluid is lifted up. So I'm going to set that to maybe 4, and then I'm going to set my dissipation a little higher, maybe 0.5. Now dissipation is basically how quickly the fluid sort of disappears. That's all I'm going to do for now. Next tab we're going to look at is velocity. And this swirl attribute here, this is really important, and this basically gives us a really fiery look once we crank that up a bit. So I'm going to set that to about 6. I'm going to add a little bit of noise in that as well, maybe 1. So let's play this back and see how it's looking. So we're seeing a lot more variation in there now. You can see it's almost starting to move a bit like a fire, but obviously it still doesn't look anything like one. To actually make it look like a fire, we have to turn on our turbulence. So we're going to go back up to contents method here. Oh, I'm sorry. First we're going to turn on some turbulence. I'm just going to chuck in a bit of turbulence. So I might just keep it pretty low, just turn the strength up to 1, and the speed maybe 0.5. Just get a bit more movement in there. You can see the turbulence is doing its job. That might be a bit high. So I'm going to turn that down even lower, maybe 0.5. Actually, instead of doing that, I'm going to turn up my frequency, maybe up to 1. And that just means the shapes in the turbulence are going to be a bit smaller. So that's probably a bit better. Okay, now, as I was saying before, the next thing we want to do is turn on our temperature. So I'm going back up to contents method, and here under temperature, I'm going to set this to dynamic grid. Now you'll see if I rewind and play, my computer is frozen. Okay, sorry about that. My Maya just crashed, as it tends to do. But I've just reloaded. Alright, so now I'm going to press play. And you'll see all of a sudden we've got these flames in here. So it's starting to look a bit more like a fire, but still not very much. So the next step is we're going to make this smoke black, because the smoke that comes off a fire is obviously not white. And that's going to really improve the look of it. So to do that, we're going to go down here to the shading tab. Now the colour of the smoke is controlled by this parameter here. So I'm actually just going to turn that down to a sort of a grey, a sort of a dark grey colour. Now another thing I can do, when I'm making fire is I can make the background of this window black, and then I'll get a better look at it. And to do that, I press Alt B, and I can cycle through the different backgrounds until I get to the black one. I just like working on black. Another thing I like to do is hide this bounding box. So to do that, I'll just go up to display and go to boundary draw. I'm just going to turn that to none. So now we don't have our grid sort of getting in the way. Alright, so now we have our fire. Pretty basic. And we're going to do a few things to improve the look of this. So back down in our shading tab, first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this yellow colour maybe a little bit white, a little bit more towards the white side and a little bit brighter. I think that like really yellow colour just looks a bit fake. I'm going to maybe make the orange a little bit more saturated. Maybe even a tiny touch redder. Of course, this is imitating a real fire, and you can make your fire any colour you want if it's magical or, you know. But let's just go with a sort of a orangey colour like that. And I'm just going to have a look at the opacity as well. And one more thing, I'm just going to drag this black in a little bit, so then it sort of reduces the area of the fire and gives us a little bit more smoke. And I'm going to go into the opacity as well. I'm going to actually expand this graph out. I'm just going to increase the opacity. So this is sort of making the flames a bit more opaque. I'm just going to sort of make a bit of a graph like this. The next thing I'm going to do is just turn this input bias down a bit, just to sort of make it a little more transparent all over again. So I start getting a bit of a better look. Maybe I'll just drag that input bias down a little more. The thing with fluids is you really just have to play with it. It's like all the other dynamic stuff, you know, you just got to tweak and tweak until it looks good, basically. I can bring that input bias up a bit. But what I might actually do, instead of doing that, is go back up to my contents details, jump into temperature and just turn up the temperature scale a bit, and that'll make it a bit hotter. And then back down in shading, I can move my orange up a bit so we get a bit less of it. It's all about just tweaking until you're happy. I think that's probably a bit too hot, so I'll turn it down a little bit. And I can also adjust the overall transparency as well. So maybe I'll just drag that a little higher. So that's a pretty good base for a fire. One other thing I might do, if I want to get a few more like interesting shapes in here, is I might just jump back up to density. And I might just add a little bit of density tension. See what one does. It sort of like makes the fire collect into shapes a little bit more. So of course I would probably keep playing with this. It's a bit taller than I'd like. Maybe I'd bring the buoyancy back down. But every time you make fire, it's going to be different, and it's really, so there's no real set of values that are going to work perfectly for every setting. So unfortunately it really is just about playing with it and getting to know the settings a lot. but that's the basics, and that should get you started.